And joining us now on the debate, Eric Lassell, Chief Economist for RBC Global Asset Management, Armin Yelnizyan, Senior Economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, John Duffy, Principal at Strategy Corps, Michael Decter, Health Policy Analyst and former Deputy Minister of Health for Ontario, and Rocco Rossi, businessman and former Ontario PC candidate for the riding of Eglinton-Lawrence. Welcome to you all. Just before we get underway, I want to bring up a board to show, well, not the recommendations, because that would be many boards, but some of the spending caps that Don Drummond put forth in his report. So let's bring that up. Okay, so healthcare, he is saying we should cap spending at 2.5 annually. Generally in this province, we spend about 5% annually. Education, he suggests to cap spending at 1% annually. Post-secondary education, 1.5% each year. Social programs cap spending at 0.5 annually. All other programs, Don Drummond is suggesting to reduce by 2.4%. So overall spending, he says, should increase by only 0.8% over the next 7 years. I want to go around the table, starting with you, John Duffy. What was your initial reaction to the report?
I'm with the crowd of cautious optimists who believe that this is a good and wise set of recommendations. I'm optimistic that the government will respond well to them and generally take up the spirit in many of the recommendations. And I think that if we do this together, the politics can be made to work and we can do something really good for this province and take it into the 21st century in terms of public services.
Michael Decter, health is your thing. You spent many years examining health from the political side and making recommendations. What jumped out at you in the report?
Well, I think a couple of things. That you mentioned 5%, but health spending's actually been growing more like 7.9%. So to cap it at 2.5 is a big sea change. Now, we did do it during the 90s, but we had the combination of the Ray social contract and the Harris cuts. So it was not without some amount of public pain that we did that. I think the recommendations really bring together a lot of very sensible things that have been proposed. They put them in a package, and they leave the government enough wriggle room on how to get it done. But, you know, I'd say that it is a sea change for a government that has spent most of its time in office spending a lot of money to suddenly be confronted with a deficit forecast that's double what they had forecast and the need to really restrain health spending.
Rocco Rossi, you've had a day to digest this. What do you think of the report?
Well, let's be clear. This was not written by some member of the Tea Party. This was written by an expert handpicked by the Premier, by Dalton McGuinty, because he's not an ideologue, because he's trying to reflect the reality. And we may debate over where exactly the percentages should be, but the reality that he's trying to reflect and underscore is that the economy's growth is slowing, and we simply won't grow ourselves out of bad spending habits. So if we don't take real action, as Michael said, there's a real sea change required, then we are being utterly irresponsible. And like John, I'm cautiously optimistic that it will be used to actually take action, but people's feet have to be kept to the fire on this.
Armin, what's your reaction to the report?
I was very struck at the way Mr. Drummond portrayed Ontario's future as basically relegating it to an economic backwater going forward.
Bleak.
Well, basically saying that we're not going to grow the way we did before, and given the growth in other provinces, that's relegating us to a second-tier status, though we have the majority of the population in one province. And that, to me, looking at his projection meant that he could bump up the number, the scare number, the shock doctrine number that is going to put everybody's feet to the fire, and provide a kind of cover for the province to be able to come in, do Drummond light, and look like a hero.
So you don't agree with his numbers?
Absolutely not. I actually think there's a lot of room for debate on the economic assumptions underlying the growth trajectory of this province and whether we're moving into a second-tier status within the country's ability to be an industrial engine, and there are revenue choices. He was told to be a one-armed warrior. Come in and fight this battle with one arm tied behind your back. There are revenue choices to be made that have not been yet discussed, though he does raise them in terms of user fees. And I think you can't have a balanced budget in a moment where you've got rapidly escalating economic inequality unless you're going to have a balanced approach to
But I guess
balancing that
the one
budget.
number you can't dispute is the deficit, $14 billion.
But you can, because the deficit is calculated on the assumption of your growth rate. And the growth rate is really suppressed going forward.
Okay, I want to get Eric to weigh in on what he thinks of your initial reaction to the report.
Right. You know, to me, numbers don't lie. Obviously, room for scope on differences of opinion over the growth rate. I happen to think 2% real growth is probably pretty realistic for Ontario for the next 7 or 8 years based on the work that I've done. And so if you need to hold it to 0.8% spending growth, or maybe you consider some tax increases, but history tells us that spending cuts do generally need to be the disproportionate share of a package of that sort. It's pretty tight stuff. And you look and you're shocked. 2.5% health spending growth is tiny, and yet at the same time, that's the biggest gain anybody's going to get. So the priorities are where they need to be in terms of health and education, and yet there's so little money to go along. You have to conclude it's very difficult, will be very difficult to implement this to the letter of the law.
Michael, do you agree with Drummond that we're on this unsustainable fiscal path?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think there's much argument that on the current deficit. I mean, you can argue about where it's going, but the current deficit is real. The government is spending 14 or 15% more delivering goods and services than it's taking in revenue. That's not a gap that you can meet by raising taxes. The province has already raised taxes twice, big increases, most recently the HST. You've got to understand that raising taxes absolutely takes money out of the pockets of Ontarians and hurts the economy. You've also got to, I think, take into account that we're in a globalizing world and that Ontario's manufacturing base is not, for the most part, competitive. I mean, we are, seeing the movement of industrial production to China and to India. The Premier's been on this case. He's been to those countries. He's come back. He said, we're not competitive. We're getting equalization from the Government of Canada. So I don't think it's a debate about whether Ontario is growing slower than the rest of the country. It is. It has been for some time. And it's very hard to see what's going to turn that. I mean, I think increasing education levels, which has been a focus, is a very good thing to do. But, our two of our biggest manufacturers went bankrupt, Chrysler and GM. And that's got to be a wake-up call for people.
That's not because of the productivity fault of Canadian workers or Ontario's workers. Since the year 2000, Ontario has been on a downward decline in economic growth because of the hemorrhaging of the manufacturing sector. That's primarily because of what happened in the wake of 2001, September, the 9/11 event. And the borders have been thickening since then. About 2 or 3 weeks ago, we signed a border deal. There's a second bridge being built across Detroit. All the numbers in the U.S. look like they've hit their rock bottom and they're coming up again. You've got a growth in jobs, a growth in purchasing power, and we've been exporting more every month for the last 7 quarters. So it doesn't seem to me, if you look at the last 10 years, you can say, well, our growth is slower than it has been in the previous 2 decades, but it's been an unusual decade.
I think it's a very tough thing to blame 9/11 for the bankruptcy of General Motors.
Oh,
and
no,
Chrysler.
I'm not saying
well,
that.
That's what you just said.
I just said that manufacturing has been in decline since
and it's in decline
9/11.
because people elsewhere in lot can make things a lot less expensively than we can.
The 3 big car manufacturers went bankrupt or approached bankruptcy because of what happened in the United States.
I mean, I guess the question,
and
though,
purchasing
is
power is starting to pick up again.
Isn't it better to overestimate the problem than underestimate
Well,
it?
this is, of course, the trademark of Mr. Drummond, is to be super cautious. And that's one approach, is to go in and expect the worst, and then you get surprise surpluses on the other side. But let's not forget that these cuts are also going to take purchasing power and quality life out of the pockets of roughly 70% of the population. 52% of the population have incomes less than $30,000.
Armin, what I find most promising about Drummond is the parts of it where what he's saying is that regardless of the causes, what's really unsustainable is the amount of money, taxpayers' dollars, that winds up inefficiently going into the sand here in the system, where we don't really see anything for it. And it's not nickel and dime waste and fraud and government mismanagement. It's not choco bites and overpriced consultants. What it really is structural problems that result in millions and millions of tax dollars that don't really get you much for your money. And I think you run down the list of the 700 pages and you look at all these recommendations, and again, they're things that public policy practitioners, people who work with the system every day, know are in there. They've brought them forward. Michael's brought them forward. He's had them at his desk. I've brought them forward. Rocco's brought them forward. We've all brought forward, why don't we do this way? And the answer has been, well, because we can't, or most often, well, because there's nothing really broke about Ontario, so why would you fix anything that isn't broke? And you've heard that for decades in this province. The great thing about Drummond is that it's a long list of things, in essence, in the recommendations, of specific things where we can do a lot better, and where it doesn't mean painful choices necessarily for consumers. They should be able to get the public services they want, up to 21st century standards, like they get in other areas of their life. The issue is, how can we deliver that? And I don't think we're talking about putting Ontario into a painful, constrained position forever. We're talking about some tough reforms that'll put us on a solid, sustainable footing that we'll be able to afford for a long time to come, under any projection scenario.
So last night on the program, we had Don Drummond and 3 former cabinet ministers, and all of the former politicians agreed that something must be done, and talked about the political feasibility of enacting the recommendations. So let's watch a little bit of that.
I'm glad you did it, frankly. I mean, it's obvious that you didn't tell me anything I didn't know. And I guess probably that's a good thing, because anyone with any economic sense or understanding of government spending could see this coming or knew this was there. What I don't like, it hasn't got a chance in hell on being implemented.
Chris is right, the political will. You talk about shooting yourself in the foot, why don't you just amputate the feet?
And Mr. McGuinty has hung his hat as the education premier. He's lowering class sizes, full day kindergarten and the like. I can't see them accepting the kind of recommendations that Don has made. They've as much said so.
Okay, Rocco Rossi, do you agree that this is politically unsellable?
Not at all. I believe, as I've always believed, that politics is the art of the possible. And the art of the possible is expanded by 2 things, leadership and context. And the context is very different today than it was in the past, because we're not talking just about Ontario. People turn on the TVs every night and see governments in Europe and around the world near default. This is a very different world. Take a very simple example within the Toronto context. The outside workers basically broke David Miller's heart and his mayoralty over their strike and their intransigence on getting rid of some rules that were really beyond the pale of anything else being paid out in the broader society. This time, they actually settled with significant compromises without a strike, because there was a firmness on the leadership side and context had changed and people understood that things were different. Facts changed. You just had Annie Kidder say that actually we were wrong on capping class sizes, that a couple of student difference actually does not make an important educational difference for our children and ends up costing us without delivering the result. We need exercises like this to ensure that we actually put systems in place, that we measure things, that we use facts and evidence bases to make decisions.
We're past the exercise, though. We're now at the point where the government has to make some decisions and take some action. And John, you've been in the back rooms before. I mean, how politically feasible is this really? When we insert politics into this, does this get done?
Sure, it gets done. It got done at the federal level. Drummond's credential on this is that he was right in the kitchen in Ottawa when the war on the deficit was being fought under Finance Minister Martin and Prime Minister Chrétien. So he knows wherever he speaks. Now, obviously, the federal and provincial government are 2 very different places, not just politically, but also in terms of how they operate. The federal government mostly writes checks. The provincial government delivers a lot more services, although it often does that through partners. When you put it all together, I think the question of political courage is going to be important. The hard ones to do here, I don't care which ones they are, they'll be the first 3. Because once you start this train rolling, I believe that if it's done properly and with some courage, there will be a constituency for this. The basic thinking is really sound here. This isn't the politics of labor versus management. I think this is pro-consumer politics. This is saying we're not getting enough for the dollars that we put in. we're putting in too much money for what we get, and we're putting in more money than we need to for what we actually need. The solution here, Ontario, is perfectly sustainable with excellent, top quality, top drawer public services into the future if we just make these reforms and produce some more efficiency. This shouldn't be, and I don't think will be, an ideological conflict.
Just briefly, take me into the back room, because Annie Kidder, representing the interest group, was just here saying no to these recommendations. I don't like these ones. These ones won't work. These ones we shouldn't go forward with. There's going to be lots of pressure on this government from all kinds of people and all kinds of groups. Tell me a little bit about the kind of pressure they're facing.
Well, I'll give you an example of one that they faced, okay? And they went ahead and did it, and you're going to see this played again and again. The issue of generic drug pricing, okay? So about a year and a half ago, the government made up its mind that it was going to take on the generic drug manufacturers and the drugstores, the chain drugstores. And they were nervous because those are well-organized lobbies. They swore that they would do negative advertising against the government if the government proceeded. But the government decided in the end that they were going to be positioned with the consumer against the producer interest, and that the consumers, the voters, would line up with them. That's exactly what happened. Sure, there was advertising, there were slugouts, but at the end of the day, the government won and didn't suffer politically, and it didn't appear as an issue at the ballot box.
But that's
again and again,
different.
but you're going to see this. There are a lot of Drummond recommendations that have the same potential political lineup where the government can be with the consumer in the public interest. And provider groups that try to say, no, you're not allowed to do this because we're going to oppose you, might find themselves in the same position as the generic drug manufacturers.
Okay, I'm going to go to Michael and then Eric. Go ahead, Michael.
The problem for the government is its coalition that brought it into office, what consisted largely of nurses and teachers. They were the swing voters that felt that Harris had been not only hard on them, but not respectful of them. And they've pumped a lot of money into those two groups. They pumped even more money into the doctors. So yes, I admired and supported the minister's courage in staring down the chain drugstores and the generic drug manufacturers. They have much less popular sway than teachers, nurses, and doctors. You're not going to balance a $16 billion heading for $30 billion shortfall without tackling the pay of those groups. Now, Drummond goes along with the government and saying, let's keep collective bargaining. But, you know, we have an economy that has slid, and we have the highest paid doctors probably in the world at this point. And,
definitely in Canada, anyway.
well, no, I think the latest numbers would say they're among the highest paid doctors in the world. There's going to have to be some give. I mean, I think they could set up a wailing wall down at Queen's Park, because every single group will come out and say, oh, you can't touch us. And they won't say you're hurting doctors, they'll say you're hurting patients, right. You're hurting students. Well, I don't happen to think, and you know, I'll say this very clearly as someone who led the social contract, I don't happen to think doctors would practice worse medicine if they took home 5% less. I don't happen to think teachers would be worse teachers if they took 5% less home. Or nurses. The reality is we're paying for all these services with borrowed money at the moment. And you can't do that. We've got every example in the world on television. I mean, this is exactly what the Italians and the Greeks did. They said, we can keep borrowing. We don't have to balance our budget. Ontario has got a budget deficit that is twice what the federal government's heading for. The federal government are going to balance their budget, and Ontario's going the other way. That's not sustainable in either economic or political terms.
And that isn't the trajectory of Ontario. In fact, Ontario took it on the chin in this last recession, while there were a number of provinces that didn't feel a thing in this recession. There were provinces and territories that were still growing throughout the recession.
Provinces with oil. Oil's $100. Ontario doesn't have any oil.
True, but Ontario has the uranium that was...
Alberta's oil.
That's true.
Ontario.
That's true, but Ontario has the uranium that the federal government just signed on for a trade deal in China a couple of weeks ago. Ontario has got the border crossing that is responsible for 25% of merchandise trade in this country, in Detroit, and they're building an access road for a second bridge. Ontario is not in the drink. And frankly, we are not Greece. We are not Italy, and it's not the 1990s. The problems that we are facing today, austerity could very well accelerate the type of austerity that is being proposed. And don't get me wrong, there are a lot of proposals in this report that a lot of people would rally around. In fact, that $30 billion scare tactic is probably what is required to get moving on some of the health reform.
It's not a scare tactic. It's a forecast by one of the best economists in the country.
If I could just finish, to be able to put a number like that out there and say we've got to do something fast because this isn't sustainable, may be exactly the pressure that's required to do some of the health reforms that all of us around this table at one point or another have talked about. Some of those health reforms are just putting together things we've been talking about for years that would be great to have the pressure to actually get moving on and actually might buy the political consensus to have movement on.
Do you agree with what you're hearing?
You know, I don't think Ontario is perhaps quite as badly off as some imagine. My expectation for growth is Ontario's growth may look a lot like the rest of Canada's growth, but that's still not very fast. And in the context of difficult demographics, it still does really, truly constrain the spending growth that you can do. And I agree, absolutely, Ontario is not Greece in any way. The debt ratio is much lower. All sorts of things are better. I think the thing that Greece regrets is not having tackled their problems 10 years ago as opposed to today. And Ontario has an opportunity to avoid those sorts of fates. Not that that's our destiny in any way, but keep in mind, Ontario is it's a second-tier government. It's not a federal government, so the same rules don't apply. You can't run 100% debt to GDP ratios. You look at other provinces, we're the second highest debt to GDP in Canada after Quebec. You look at states, we're higher than just about all of them. And you look at debt ratings, and again, there's no enormous urgency. We've got a AA debt rating. That's a long distance from big trouble, but of course it's on negative watch. It's at risk of going down. And you look in the US, and sure, we're better than California, we're better than Illinois, we're maybe the same as New Jersey and Michigan, but we're worse than most US states. So there's some hard work to be done here.
You know, we've heard the word Greece several times, and I know we're all saying we're not Greece, but people at home, the average Ontarian, gets scared even at the prospect of us being anything like Greece. And I just want to go back to the last election, because I'm wondering, I want to ask you, Rocco, did the parties handcuff themselves in this past election by being willingly unrealistic about the province's books?
Well, I think the reality is that when elections come around, people try to simplify things and they look for the best numbers that they can find that fit their case. And this is going to be an issue in terms of sustaining credibility around building the case for what needs to be done. But it is time for an adult conversation, and I think that the reality of what Mr. Drummond has put on the table needs to be taken seriously. This government has not shown, as Michael has laid out very well, and as the AG has also laid out, this government has not shown a willingness to actually control cost and an ability to control cost. The central core of their electoral coalition is the one that is going to, in many respects, be affected the most by most of the recommendations in Drummond. That is very different from the generic drug suppliers, and that will take significant political courage, and I'm not sure they have the stomach for it.
Well,
go ahead.
Therein lies that's probably the heart of the matter, Rocco. With your customary concision, I think you've really nailed it. It's do they have the heart and stomach for the fight? I think they've shown that they have, and I think they're in the generic fight. But I think at the same time, you know, Michael's quite right to say there's going to be a subtle shift in what the Liberal constituency is on all this, from being a government that has been largely about peace in the valley, in healthcare and education, largely through ensuring a comfort level among provider groups and saying to consumers, okay, look, you know, everything's fine. It's going to have to shift, because I think the consumer interest is going to have to become a little more paramount.
How do you undo those promises, though?
I don't know about undoing promises, but the world's changed a lot since 2003. I mean, what's really over is this happy talk at the federal and provincial levels, I think, that say, you know, oh, we're doing so much better than someone else. The reality is it's an interdependent global economy. But I look at, there's so many examples. There's one little recommendation in there that's just sort of 2 lines, but it's enormous, and it really is paradigmatic of the kind of thing Drummond is talking about that makes me optimistic. It says, let's take, right now there are 75 or over 80 local municipal hydros that distribute electricity to individual homes in this province. Some of them have subscriber bases as small as 200 people. Now, you do not need a separate company to service 200 customers to deliver electricity off the grid. There are tons of those. It's been a focus of government policy for 10 years that there should be much fewer, that there should be consolidation. Experts say that you could reduce the cost of distribution by up to 15%. Now, who's going to oppose that, right? Who would be against that? Well, the reality is Tim Hudak has said again and again that he's against touching municipal hydros because, I don't know, he doesn't have a justification, but he says it would impinge, I guess, on municipal power. If the government takes it on, it'll be really interesting to watch consumers where they line up and whether they line up with the government, as they did on drug pricing, against an entrenched interest that might have trouble justifying why it exists.
John,
there's a lot of these in
rounding
Drummond.
error.
No, it's not around. 15% on your distribution cost in your electricity bill, Rocco, is not a rounding error. It's quite sufficient, in fact, to get towards taking off the $1.5 billion of the energy rebate that Drummond says has got to come off the tax base. There's a lot of these little closed loops in here that you can unravel effectively if the government wins the first 2 or 3 fights and shows some momentum and builds a constituency for consumer-based, pro-change development in this province in a forward together sort of way. So I think the politics are doable.
The government is going to, you keep using consumer, I'd use taxpayer. Yeah. I mean, the government has been a government that has relied largely on stakeholder management, stakeholder coalitions of people who receive their incomes from government. And, you know, I dissent heartily from the view that this burden's going to fall on the 99%. You've got 24,000 doctors in the province. Virtually every one of them is in the 1%. The cutoff in Ontario is 164, 170,000. You know, there isn't a hospital CEO in the province doesn't make that. So, you know, the idea that the public sector is filled with people on low incomes would only be a view held by someone who hasn't ever had a look at the Sunshine List. The public sector is extremely well paid. It's far better paid than the small business sector, and it doesn't contain the working poor. The working poor, who are the people that get hit with tax increases, are actually the people that don't work in the government, because government is rather well paid. But so I think this government's going to have a choice of whether they want to reach over the heads of the vested interests, the doctors, the bargaining agents, and speak to taxpayers and say, look, you know, we did a lot of things, a lot of good things. We got a little carried away in good times. Now times are tough. We can't keep borrowing money, and everybody's going to have to put a little water in their wine. That's what the Drummond report says, and I think there should be broad-based support for that.
I want an opportunity to correct the way what I said got characterized. I don't believe that the low-wage workers are the ones that are in government. I'm saying that the type of the 362 cuts that are there, we're looking at cuts to making people that live in the countryside pay for buses to get their kids to school. We're talking about cutting 25% of the budget for textbooks and supplies and classrooms, where, you know, well-to-do neighborhoods can do fundraising much more effectively than poor neighborhoods, because you're going to pay more for those things. I'm talking about people on Ontario disability having an effectively cut to their purchasing power. We are not talking, I'm not talking about the public servants that are going to get hit. On the contrary, I think that the doctors could pay more money. I think there are enough people in this province. This money is rolling with rich people and with very successful corporations that are not investing back in our economy. We can take that, we can take a little bit of revenue from some people that can afford to pay more. We can actually capture better royalties. We're getting 13.5% royalties on our metallic resources. That's less than any other province in this country. And gold is on the up and up. Copper, nickel, the things that we do export in terms, we don't have oil, but we have those things, and they are expanding markets.
So
but all I'm saying is, if you've got a 1% solution for people that are rolling in it, and all they're being asked to do is don't ask for more. For the doctors, in fact, they can give a little bit more. There can be cuts through the system. There's plenty of room for efficiencies.
You mentioned textbooks. You know, it's a really good example of the opportunities here. Textbooks should be digital. I'm really hopeful that the digitization of education, which Drummond talks about, and I'm really hopeful that the PSE sector is going to move substantially in a digital direction, that takes textbooks right off the table. It crushes the
John,
cost
go and
of these
visit a
things.
school in Thorncliffe.
They're
not digitizing books. They don't have money for paper and pencils for their classrooms. They can't provide English as a second language to their immigrant students.
Is that there are enormous opportunities for productivity increases, for reducing costs, for doing all sorts of things in a more effective way without creating the kind of carnage and painful choices that people are going to talk about, I think, too much. People have experienced, folks throughout society, at all levels of society, have experienced better service in the past 20 years through information technology out of such clunker institutions as banks, telecom companies, insurance providers, even heaven help us, the cable companies are a bit more responsive. Surely government can get to those productivity improvements themselves and give everybody good service for less money. There's got to be savings in that, and for too long, the politics of it ain't broke, don't fix it have got in the way of that revolution coming to Ontario, and I'm really glad that Drummond's going to bring that and head off the painful choices you're describing, let alone the ones that they're experiencing.
But it's not Drummond that's going to have to do it. It's going to be the government.
No, it's going to be government implementers,
well,
and they're going to need help.
Rocco, I mean, in the political world, I mean, you have to go sell this thing. And 100%. What do? You throw up your hands and say, okay, facts on the ground changed. Okay, you have to raise taxes. I mean, it's a hard sell job to do to the public, is it not?
It's absolutely it is, but because those facts need to come out, and the Drummond report is part of it. What people see in terms of the international context is part of it. What people saw in London with Caterpillar is part of it. I mean, look at what's happening in the private sector, where really brutal decisions are being made. We're not talking about going there. What we're talking about, as Michael said, water in people's wine that need to see what is going on, and you have to be prepared to lead by example.
Well, let me push this a bit further, because take politician A, vote for me because I won't raise your taxes, right. Vote for me and I'll make sure that the healthcare system won't change, vote for me because I'll do this. Suddenly they're saying...
Well, I'll take you back. I sat at this very table with a panel during the election that included David Dodge, the former governor of the Bank of Canada, and the Deputy Minister of Finance that helped balance the federal budget. And David said, and the reason we had the panel, all three parties are lying to the people of Ontario. They've all adopted the assumptions in the 2011 budget, and they've made the deficit and debt a non-issue. And the problem with that, and he was dead right, is that after the election, when the real numbers come out, and that's exactly what Drummond has done, he's put the real numbers on the table, then it's going to be very hard for the public to trust their political leadership, because they were told there isn't a problem. They were told during the campaign by all three parties the deficit will be paid off, we'll be down to a balanced budget in 5 years. And I can tell you, it wasn't that anything happened in the 35 days of the campaign that changed that. It was no party wanted to campaign on the real numbers, because the implication of the real numbers is some pretty big changes to public services in the province.
Does the public want to be lied to, though?
No, I don't think the public wants to be lied to. I think there are perverse incentives in the way political campaigns work that have to do with media and political parties that make happy talk privileged and more valuable than telling it like it is. But this stuff doesn't have to be painful politically. I'll give you a local example, because where the rubber always hits the road on this is when it actually hits your community. Some change has got to happen to a community institution. So supposedly the scariest, most difficult things in Drummond include hospital amalgamations. There are hospital amalgamations that are going on around this province. My firm has been involved in one of them with two big institutions to the west of Toronto in 905. And you know what? They have not resulted in huge explosions, because care and tact and spending time with stakeholders, including community folks, telling them that this isn't about slashing costs, this is about not going to hurt their care, it's going to result in a better customer experience and a better user experience for them, and it's also going to reduce the inefficiency and help sustain the health system. Those are stories that if you explain them carefully, respectfully, listen to people and get their input and involve them, you can move these things through the system without terrible political problems.
How do you do it, though, John? Because how do you get a teacher to, agree to say, okay, let's increase class size? You're saying, okay, it's approach, be gentler, kinder. Is that what you do?
Well, gentleness and kindness go a tremendous distance. I mean, Michael was able to get the social contract 80% of the way to the goal line through a lot of talk and patient discussion. And in the end, something much worse was avoided. You don't want to disparage the value of this stuff.
Town halls, bus advertising.
Town
what are we
halls,
talking about?
social media usage, reserving portions of decision making that say we're going to do what the public tells us to. Gain shares on a change, like Mrs. Thatcher pioneered. We're going to move this service out, but part of the value, we're going to actually send a check to individual Britons because this is theirs. There is a toolkit that you can use to involve people and engage people and make them and allow them to own these decisions so that they get behind them. It's not the era of top-down government and swinging cuts is over. What I love about Drummond is that he actually doesn't try to do the big meat axe approach. He understands it's going to be case by case, file by file, community by community, and a different approach. Again, that's why I'm with the optimists. I think this is a document for 21st century governance.
Make no mistake, though, it's going to require courage. I mean, you're slipping back into happy talk, John, from time to time.
I'm not nearly gloomy enough for Drumageddon. You're right, Rocco. I need to put on my bad face.
No. I don't think it's Drumageddon.
I like Drumageddon. Nice.
It's about. It is about being honest. It is about laying it out. I mean, to be fair. We were calling in the election a cut to 3% growth, not the 2.5% that Drummond is saying. And we were saying that outside of healthcare and education, 2% cuts to budget each year for a 4-year term. So the numbers weren't as big as needed, and certainly the consensus around the growth number, which is a big part of the driver of this, has moved south of where it was when the original Ontario budget was tabled. But that said, it will take courage, and the question is, will they be prepared? And there is a new context here because of what people see around the world.
Eric, let me ask you this, because in the report several times, Don Drummond talks about that the public will be surprised, that they will be shocked by the severity of the restraint needed, that the public really hasn't been kept well informed of the actual fiscal challenges that we're in. How do you get the public to be more fiscally literate at this point?
I think we're probably doing it right now, and the discussions surrounding the Drummond report will go some distance. I think it takes time beyond that, and frankly, the best thing that could happen to Ontario is if Moody's downgrades us later this year. Sometimes a bit of bond market pain is exactly what the doctor ordered. If any country or province in the world can wrap their head around austerity and value balanced budgets, it seems to me Canadians and Ontarians have some history of doing precisely that. And there's an interesting literature out there, and it talks about fiscal austerity and the political costs or lack thereof. And obviously places like Greece are an exception, and there are enormous political costs. In fact, every southern European country has lost its leader. But for more moderate austerity of the sort that's being proposed here, it generally is not politically costly. People do come around, and they understand that this is actually necessary.
If it is moderate austerity, and what we are seeing, even the IMF saying, is that austerity is actually now starting to stifle growth as it is occurring elsewhere. That's what you want to avoid, is that whatever you're calling fiscal prudence, so that you don't have unsustainable deficits, the measures that you undertake don't actually throttle whatever growth you are having. When we talk about actually cutting people that in the healthcare and the education sectors, I'm not saying that that is a good or a bad idea. I'm just saying that's primarily where the growth in jobs has come in the wake of the recession. And so when you take a look at the picture that occurred just before the recession began, growing inequality was a feature of Ontario at a rate that eclipsed what was happening in many other jurisdictions. And 52% of the people in this province have incomes of less than $30,000. In the period of 2001 to 2008, those incomes of those people dropped on average. The group in the middle, 30,000 to 60,000, that group shrank in a period. So again, we are dealing with greater disparity, more poverty. Sometimes the measures we're talking about do produce greater efficiency and better service. I'm all for those. I don't want to spend another penny that I don't have to spend. But if those measures are going to actually make it harder for the vast majority of Ontarians, then we're actually suffocating our own growth. That's the purchasing power we need to be out there driving the marketplace.
I visited the IMF in December, and certainly, I think one of the positive things in this report is they're looking for efficiency gains. They're trying to catch the low-hanging fruit here. And obviously, there will still be pain. We know that cuts result in weaker growth and pain as well. There are ways to minimize that, and the IMF finds that spending cuts do tend to be a bit less costly than tax increases. By no means are they dogmatically in favor of one or the other, but generally you do tend to tilt in that direction. One of the problems with tax increases, and sometimes they're justified, sometimes not, but one of the problems is you end up with a bit more inflation, and sometimes the central bank has to raise rates a little bit to offset it, and you end up with additional costs coming through that side. We know that spending as a share of the Ontario GDP is unusually high right now, so it's not as though we're low.
We went through a recession. Of course
Okay.
it's going to
So
be
it should be,
unusually
but
high.
Folks,
it
we're
will
just
need to
about
come
out of
down.
time. I've got about 30 seconds left. John, I want to end with you here. I want to ask you, your phone's ringing in the other room. It's Premier McGuinty. He says, John, help me implement this thing. What advice are you going to give him?
Be open to ideas that come from the outside. Let them help you. Government can't do all of this by itself. It is going to need implementation plans, sophisticated thinking. It's going to need a lot of help from stakeholders who actually are lined up with consumer interests. And I would say, bon courage. This is why you ran for the third time. You kind of knew this was coming, and it'll be the making of you.
Well, maybe your phone's ringing right now. We'll see later.
Thanks
a lot to you all. Thanks for joining us for this great conversation. Thank you to John Duffy of Strategy Corps, Eric Lassell, Chief Economist of RBC Global Asset Management, Michael Decter, former Ontario Deputy Minister of Health, former Chair also of Hi, and on the other side of the table, Rocco Rossi, businessman and former PC candidate, and Armin Yelnesian, Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Thank you all very much.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.